The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Captain David Walker strode through Terminal B of Denver International Airport, his pilot's uniform crisp despite the early hour. 20 years of flying commercial planes had taught him to spot trouble from a mile away, but today his mind was elsewhere. His daughter had just gotten accepted into medical school, and he couldn't stop smiling about it. As he went through his pre-flight checklist in the cockpit of Flight 2317 to Chicago, his co-pilot Tom noticed his good mood. "Someone's cheerful today," Tom remarked, adjusting his headset. "When your kid gets into their dream school, you earn the right to grin like an idiot," David replied, checking the weather radar one more time. The forecast showed clear skies all the way to Chicago, perfect flying conditions. The boarding process went smoothly until David glimpsed 3 men through the cockpit door. They stuck out like sore thumbs among the usual mix of business travelers and families. All 3 wore leather vests decorated with patches, chains jingling at their sides as they moved down the aisle. The largest one had knuckles covered in faded tattoos, while the shortest sported a thick beard that couldn't quite hide a nasty scar along his jaw. What caught David's attention wasn't their appearance. He'd flown everyone from rock stars to politicians. It was the way they carried themselves, scanning the cabin like they owned it. They were members of the Steel Riders Motorcycle Club. He recognized their patches from a news story last month about a bar fight in Nevada. Lisa, his head flight attendant for 5 years, popped her head into the cockpit. "Everything okay, Captain?" she asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "Just fine," David assured her, but he made a mental note to stay alert. His years in the Air Force Special Operations, before switching to commercial flying, had taught him to trust his instincts. Something about these passengers set off quiet alarm bells in his mind. As he performed his final checks, David thought about how different his life was now compared to his military days. Back then, he'd been dropping supplies to troops in combat zones, dodging anti-aircraft fire. Now, his biggest challenges usually involve navigating through bad weather or dealing with the occasional unruly passenger. He loved the peace of commercial flying, the satisfaction of safely carrying hundreds of people to their destinations. The boarding door closed with a heavy thunk. David adjusted his seat, took a deep breath, and began the pre-flight announcements. His voice carried the same calm confidence it always did, giving no hint of his slight unease about the 3 bikers. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 2317 to Chicago O'Hare. Our flying time today will be approximately 3 hours and 20 minutes. As the plane pushed back from the gate, David couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be just another routine flight. The rising sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, but somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that storm clouds might be gathering, even on this clear morning. He'd learned long ago that being prepared wasn't the same as being paranoid. So as the engine spooled up and the plane began its taxi to the runway, David ran through mental scenarios like he'd been trained to do. Not because he expected trouble, but because 20 years of flying had taught him that the unexpected always happened when you least expected it. Little did he know, his instincts were right on the money. This flight would test every skill he'd learned, both in the Air Force and as a commercial pilot. But for now, he focused on the familiar ritual of takeoff, his hands steady on the controls as the plane gathered speed and lifted into the morning sky. The first 3 hours of Flight 2317 passed smoothly enough. The plane cruised at 36,000 feet, passengers dozed or watched movies on their screens, and the gentle hum of the engines created that familiar peaceful atmosphere that David had come to love about long-haul flights. Lisa, the head flight attendant, had just finished serving drinks in first class when she noticed a change in the atmosphere toward the back of the plane. The 3 men in leather vests, who had been relatively quiet since takeoff, were becoming increasingly vocal. Their laughter carried through the cabin, making nearby passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Another round," called out Ray, the one with the beard, his voice carrying over the engine noise. When Lisa approached their row, she maintained her professional smile, though something in her eyes suggested caution. "I'm sorry, sir, but I notice you've already had several drinks. I'll need to check with the captain about serving more alcohol at this time," she said politely, her hands clasped in front of her. The largest of the 3 men leaned forward, his leather vest creaking. "Check with the captain." Since when does he run a bar up there? His attempt at humor carried an edge that made several nearby passengers glance up from their books and tablets. A businessman across the aisle pretended to be absorbed in his laptop, but his fingers had stopped typing. A young mother 3 rows ahead pulled her sleeping child closer, while an elderly couple exchanged worried glances. "It's standard procedure, sir," Lisa explained, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "I'll be happy to bring you some water or soft drinks in the meantime." "Listen, sweetheart," Ray started, but his friend, who everyone had heard him call Buck, cut him off. "We paid good money for these tickets," Buck said, standing up slightly before remembering the low ceiling. "And we expect the same service as everyone else." His voice wasn't particularly loud, but it carried that particular tone that suggested trouble brewing. The third man, who hadn't said much until now, added, "Maybe you're discriminating against us because of how we look." He smiled as he said it, but there was nothing friendly about the expression. Lisa maintained her composure, drawing on years of experience handling difficult situations. "Sir, I assure you this has nothing to do with appearances. It's purely about airline safety regulations." A young flight attendant named Katie, newer to the job, approached to help, but Lisa supply motioned for her to stay back. The situation was delicate enough without adding another person to the mix. 2 rows behind the bikers, an off-duty police officer who had shown Lisa his badge during boarding sat up straighter, clearly monitoring the situation. His presence was reassuring, but Lisa hoped it wouldn't come to needing his help. "Regulations?" Ray scoffed, his voice getting louder. "I'll tell you about regulations. We're part of a motorcycle club that's got its own regulations, and one of them is we don't take kindly to being treated like second-class citizens." The cabin seemed to grow smaller as other passengers tried to make themselves invisible while still watching the scene unfold. A teenager who had been about to get up to use the bathroom quickly sat back down, deciding it could wait. In the cockpit, David's instincts from earlier proved right as the cabin intercom buzzed. Tom, his co-pilot, handled the initial call while David kept his eyes on their approach path through the gathering clouds. "Situation brewing in the back," Tom reported quietly, covering his mic. "Those bikers we noticed during boarding are giving Lisa a hard time about the drink service." David nodded, already thinking through scenarios. He'd handled unruly passengers before, but something about these men suggested this might be different. His years of experience told him that alcohol-fueled confrontations at 36,000 feet had a way of escalating quickly if not handled properly. Back in the cabin, Buck had stood up completely now, despite the seatbelt sign being on. "Maybe we should take this up with your captain directly," he suggested, taking a step toward the front of the plane. "Since he's apparently running this bar from up there." Lisa stood her ground, though she took a small step backward. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat. The seatbelt sign is on, and for everyone's safety." "Safety?" Ray interrupted with a harsh laugh. "We've been riding motorcycles longer than you've been flying, honey. Don't talk to us about safety." The tension in the cabin had reached a point where even passengers wearing headphones had taken them off, aware that something was wrong. A college student quietly began recording with his phone, trying to be discreet about it. As David listened to Tom's updates about the situation, he knew he'd soon have to make a decision about how to handle this. The weather ahead showed some turbulence, which would only complicate things if the situation wasn't resolved quickly. What nobody on the plane realized yet was that this confrontation was about to take a turn that would make national headlines, and it wouldn't end the way anyone expected, least of all the 3 men who thought they could intimidate their way into getting what they wanted. The situation reached its breaking point during what should have been a routine trip to the restroom. David had asked Tom to take control of the aircraft while he took a brief break, something he'd done countless times over his career. As he stepped out of the cockpit, adjusting his uniform jacket, he could feel the tension in the cabin. It was like static electricity before a storm. He'd barely closed the cockpit door when Buck suddenly rose from his seat, bumping into a young woman who was returning from the bathroom. She stumbled, dropping her phone, which skidded across the floor. Instead of apologizing, Buck just smirked and took another step toward the front of the plane. "Perfect timing," Buck called out, his voice carrying over the engine noise. "Just the man we wanted to see." His 2 friends stood up as well, creating an imposing presence in the narrow aisle. David took in the scene quickly, noting every detail with the sharp awareness that came from years of military training. He saw Lisa's concerned expression, the nervous glances from nearby passengers, and the way the three men had positioned themselves to block the aisle. More importantly, he noticed how Buck's hands were clenched into fists, how Ray was shifting his weight like a boxer about to throw a punch, and how their third companion was glancing toward the emergency exit. "Gentlemen," David said calmly, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone used to commanding rooms much larger than an airplane cabin. "I need you to return to your seats." He kept his tone professional but firm, the same voice he used countless times during his military service to diffuse tense situations. A businessman in first class reached slowly for the flight attendant call button, but stopped when Ray shot him a warning look. The cabin had grown so quiet that the hum of the engines seemed oddly loud. "We just want to discuss your drink policy," Captain Buck said, taking another step forward. "Seems your staff here doesn't appreciate paying customers." The mock politeness in his voice had an edge sharp enough to cut. David thought about his daughter's medical school acceptance letter still sitting in his jacket pocket. He'd been planning to frame it when he got home. Funny how the mind works in moments like these, focusing on small, personal details while sizing up a dangerous situation. "I stand by my crew's decisions regarding alcohol service," David replied, standing his ground. "Now for everyone's safety, please return to your seats. We're expecting some turbulence ahead." This wasn't technically a lie. There were always bumpy patches somewhere. "Safety?" Ray laughed, the sound harsh and artificial. "That's what your little flight attendant kept saying. But maybe we're tired of being told what to do by people who think they're better than us." The off-duty police officer who had been watching everything was now reaching slowly for something in his carry-on. David caught his eye and gave a slight shake of his head. The last thing they needed was to escalate the situation further. A child 3 rows back started crying softly, and his mother tried to quiet him while avoiding drawing attention to themselves. The sound seemed to momentarily break the tension, reminding everyone that there were families aboard. Buck took another step forward, putting him within arm's reach of David. "Maybe we should step into your office up front," he suggested, nodding toward the cockpit. "Have a private chat about customer service." That's when David saw it, the slight movement of Ray's hand toward his vest pocket. 20 years of commercial flying might have softened his appearance, but 10 years in the Air Force Special Operations had taught him to spot trouble coming. The movement was subtle, probably meant to intimidate rather than actually harm, but David couldn't take that chance. Not with 162 souls in his care at 36,000 feet. Time seemed to slow down, just like it used to during his military operations. He could see everything with crystal clarity, the sweat on Buck's forehead, the nervous tapping of a passenger's foot 3 rows back, the reflection of the cabin lights in the window showing the dark clouds they were approaching. What happened next would later be described in a dozen different ways by as many witnesses. Some would say it was like watching a dance, others would compare it to a scene from an action movie. But what really happened was much simpler. It was just a pilot doing what he'd been trained to do: protect his passengers, his crew, and his aircraft, using the skills he'd hoped he'd never need to use again. The 3 men who thought they had cornered an easy target were about to learn a valuable lesson about making assumptions. And David, who had started his day thinking about his daughter's future in medical school, was about to remind himself that sometimes the skills from your past have a way of becoming surprisingly relevant in the present. What happened next would later be described by passengers as watching poetry in motion. David's military training took over with the smoothness of muscle memory, each movement precise and controlled. Time seemed to slow down in that way it does during critical moments, when every detail becomes crystal clear. As Buck reached for the cockpit door, David stepped sideways in the narrow aisle, using the confined space to his advantage. His movement was so fluid that Buck's aggressive lunge met nothing but empty air. In the same motion, David gently but firmly redirected Buck's momentum, causing him to stumble off balance. "Sir, please don't make this situation worse than it needs to be," David said calmly, his voice steady despite the tension. He kept his movements defensive, focused entirely on control rather than confrontation. Years of training had taught him that the best technique was one that protected everyone involved, even those causing the trouble. Ray tried to rush forward to help his friend, but the narrow airplane aisle worked against him. David simply shifted his stance, using Ray's own forward motion to guide him into an awkward position against the empty seats. It looked almost like a dance step, smooth and controlled, with none of the chaos usually associated with confrontations. "He's some kind of expert," someone whispered from the back, and murmurs of amazement spread through the cabin. A teenager who had been recording everything on his phone merely dropped it, amazed by how different this was from the violent scenes he'd expected. The third man, who had been hanging back, now realized this wasn't going according to plan. He started to reach into his vest, but David's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "I wouldn't. The Air Marshal 3 rows back has been watching you since Denver." This was a calculated bluff. There was no Air Marshal, only the off-duty police officer, but the man's hand froze. Lisa used this moment to start moving passengers from the nearby rows, quietly redirecting them to empty seats toward the back of the plane. Her professionalism helped keep the situation from causing panic. This wasn't chaos. This was a controlled response to unruly behavior. Buck tried to regain his footing, but found himself gently but firmly guided into a seat. David's techniques were purely defensive, designed to control rather than harm. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who had trained for years in close-quarters situations, though he had hoped never to use these skills on a commercial flight. "Folks," David addressed the cabin while maintaining his position, "everything's under control. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." His voice carried the same calm authority he used during weather announcements, helping to keep the atmosphere from becoming charged with panic. A young mother who had been fearfully clutching her child now relaxed slightly, seeing how professionally the situation was being handled. An elderly man who had risen halfway out of his seat to help sat back down, nodding with approval at the captain's controlled response. The off-duty police officer had moved closer but stayed back, recognizing that the pilot had the situation well in hand. He was impressed by the display of defensive techniques that effectively neutralized the threat without causing any injury or escalation. Tom's voice came over the intercom. "Captain, everything all right out there?" The co-pilot had been monitoring the situation, ready to make an emergency landing if necessary. "All under control, Tom," David replied, keeping his tone conversational. "But please radio ahead for security to meet us at the gate." He turned his attention back to the 3 men, who now looked significantly less confident than they had minutes ago. "Gentlemen, here's what's going to happen," David explained calmly. "You're going to sit quietly for the remainder of our flight. Any further disruption will result in federal charges. As I'm sure you're aware, interfering with a flight crew is a serious offense." The entire cabin seemed to release a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. What could have turned into a dangerous confrontation had instead become a masterclass in professional crisis management. Several passengers had witnessed similar situations on other flights turn ugly, but this was different. There was no shouting, no violence, just calm, professional control. A businessman who had been nervously gripping his armrest finally relaxed, impressed by how the situation had been handled. As Lisa began resuming normal cabin service, she caught David's eye and gave him a grateful nod. The other flight attendants started moving through the cabin again, their presence helping to restore the normal rhythm of the flight. David knew there would be paperwork and reports to file when they landed, but for now, his focus remained on maintaining the calm atmosphere he'd restored. He thought again about his daughter's medical school acceptance letter in his pocket, about how proud she would be to know her dad had resolved a potentially dangerous situation without anyone getting hurt. The rest of the cabin crew smoothly shifted into their emergency protocols, subtly checking on passengers and ensuring everyone felt safe. The incident had shown everyone on board something important. Sometimes real strength isn't about showing how tough you are, but about knowing how to prevent a situation from escalating in the first place. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted dramatically. The 3 men who had been so intimidating just moments ago now sat quietly in their seats, their earlier bravado completely deflated. Buck kept adjusting his leather vest, trying to maintain some dignity, while Ray stared straight ahead, his face flushed with embarrassment. A young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, whispered loudly to her mother, "Mom, did you see how the captain moved? It was like in my gymnastics class, all smooth and balanced." Her innocent observation brought a few gentle chuckles from nearby passengers, helping to further ease the tension. David remained near the front of the cabin, his posture relaxed but alert. He'd learned during his military days that the moments after a confrontation were just as crucial as the confrontation itself. "Lisa," he called softly to his head flight attendant, "let's get some water for our friends here." The simple gesture served multiple purposes. Staying hydrated would help calm them down, and the act of service reminded everyone that this was still, at its heart, a normal commercial flight. The off-duty police officer, who had moved to a closer seat during the confrontation, nodded approvingly. He'd seen plenty of tense situations in his career, and he recognized the skillful way the pilot was transforming potential troublemakers into subdued passengers. An elderly couple who had been visibly frightened earlier now smiled at each other, the husband patting his wife's hand reassuringly. "Reminds me of that flight we took to Hawaii in '82, he said just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Remember that fellow who had too much to drink? The crew handled him just as professionally." The third member of the biker group, who had been the quietest throughout the ordeal, suddenly spoke up. "Look, Captain," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect, "we got carried away. It won't happen again." The admission seemed to cost him something, but the sincerity was clear. David acknowledged the apology with a professional nod. "I appreciate that, sir. We all want the same thing here, to reach our destination safely." His response offered a dignified way forward, allowing the men to save face while maintaining the new order in the cabin. Tom's voice crackled over the intercom. "Captain, we're about 30 minutes from Chicago. Weather's clear for our approach." The routine announcement served as a reminder that life was returning to normal. A businessman who had been typing on his laptop looked up and smiled. "Best in-flight entertainment I've ever had," he quipped quietly to his seatmate. "And I didn't even have to pay extra for it." The gentle humor helped further dissolve the remaining tension. Lisa moved efficiently through the cabin, checking on passengers while maintaining a professional demeanor. When she reached the three men with their water, her service was impeccable, neither overly friendly nor cold, just perfectly professional. It was a masterclass in how to treat passengers who had crossed a line but were now back in compliance. A college student who had been recording the earlier confrontation on his phone now sat back, slightly disappointed that there wouldn't be any more dramatic footage to share. Instead, he found himself impressed by how anticlimactic the resolution had become. No shouting, no handcuffs, just quiet authority and professional control. The air in the cabin felt lighter now, though David knew better than to completely let his guard down. He'd seen too many situations reignite after seeming to cool off. But he could tell by the body language of the three men that their fight was gone, replaced by a mixture of embarrassment and resignation. Around the cabin, other passengers had begun returning to their normal flight routines. Some pulled out books or magazines, others adjusted their headphones or checked their watches. The incident was becoming just another story to tell friends and family after landing, albeit a more exciting one than usual. An older gentleman in first class, who had remained remarkably calm throughout the entire incident, caught David's eye and gave him a knowing look. Something in his bearing suggested military background, and his slight nod carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what kind of skills had been displayed. As David prepared to return to the cockpit, he noticed Buck staring at his own reflection in the window, looking somewhat lost in thought. It was a reminder that sometimes people act out because of their own internal struggles, not because they're truly bad people. The realization didn't excuse their behavior, but it helped maintain the professional compassion that was part of David's job. "Captain," Lisa said softly as she passed, "Chicago ground crew confirms security will meet us at the gate." Her words carried the subtle message that while the immediate situation was resolved, there would still be consequences for the earlier disruption. The remaining minutes of the flight would be routine, but David knew this incident would be talked about for weeks to come. Not because of any violence or drama, but because it demonstrated how proper training and professional conduct could transform a potentially dangerous situation into a masterclass in conflict resolution. With the situation under control, David's focus shifted to following proper airline protocols. He'd handled the immediate threat, but now came the equally important task of documenting everything while ensuring the remainder of the flight went smoothly. His military training had taught him that proper procedure after an incident was just as crucial as handling the incident itself. "Tom," He spoke into his headset as he prepared to return to the cockpit. "Log everything that's happened in the last 20 minutes. We'll need it for the report." His co-pilot acknowledged with a quick copy that, the professionalism in his voice helping maintain the calm atmosphere in the cabin. Lisa appeared with the plane's emergency kit, removing several pairs of flexible restraints. The three bikers watched nervously, but David shook his head. "I don't think we'll need those," he said quietly. "But keep them handy just in case." It was a calculated decision, showing trust while maintaining authority. The off-duty police officer, who had moved to a seat closer to the troublemakers, nodded in agreement. His presence alone served as a deterrent against any further disruption. He'd seen how situations could escalate when people felt humiliated, and he appreciated the captain's approach to maintaining dignity while ensuring safety. A flight attendant moved through the cabin with forms for witnesses to fill out. Several passengers, including a retired teacher who had watched everything unfold, began writing detailed accounts of what they'd observed. The college student who had recorded part of the incident on his phone offered to share the footage with the crew. "Just doing our job," David told an impressed businessman who tried to compliment him. The real heroes are the crew who deal with challenging situations every day. His humility wasn't false modesty. He genuinely believed in the importance of teamwork in aviation. Lisa organized her cabin crew with quiet efficiency, having them return to their normal service routine while keeping a watchful eye on the situation. The normalcy helped passengers relax, though many still stole glances at the three subdued men who had caused such a stir. "Chicago approach, this is Flight 2317. David's voice remained steady as he radioed ahead, requesting priority handling and security presence at Gate B12. Situation stable but precautionary measures advised. The controller's response was professional and immediate, assuring him that everything would be ready upon landing. A young mother caught David's eye as he completed his preparations to return to the cockpit. "Thank you," she mouthed silently, holding her sleeping child. He responded with a gentle smile, reminded again of why he loved his job, not for the excitement, but for the responsibility of keeping everyone safe. Buck, the leader of the biker group, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What happens when we land?" he'd asked, his earlier bravado replaced by genuine concern. David appreciated the directness of the question. "That depends on you," he replied calmly. "Stay seated, follow crew instructions, and cooperate with the authorities when we land. The airline will press charges for the disruption, but your behavior from this point forward matters." It was the same tone he used countless times during his military career, firm but fair, offering a path forward. The elderly couple who had been nervous earlier now relaxed enough to share their snacks, the wife's homemade cookies making their way around nearby seats. It was a small gesture that somehow made everything feel more normal, transforming the cabin from a scene of confrontation back into a community of travelers. Tom's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Please ensure your seats are in the upright position and your seat belts are fastened." David took one last look around the cabin before returning to the cockpit. The three men sat quietly, their expressions a mixture of embarrassment and resignation. Other passengers had largely returned to their books, tablets, or conversations, though there was still an undercurrent of excitement about what they'd witnessed. "Quite a flight," Tom commented as David settled back into his seat. The understatement made both pilots smile. They'd trained for situations like this, but had hoped never to use that training. As they began their descent into Chicago, David thought about how he'd tell this story to his daughter. She'd probably say it was just like her dad to handle a crisis with calm professionalism. The thought made him smile. Some lessons about staying cool under pressure were best taught by example. The setting sun painted the Chicago skyline in golden hues as Flight 2317 approached its final destination. In the cabin behind him, passengers began gathering their belongings, their conversations now focused on connecting flights and dinner plans rather than the excitement from earlier. It was exactly how David wanted it: routine, professional, safe. As Flight 2317 taxied to Gate B12 at Chicago O'Hare, the last rays of sunlight streamed through the windows. 2 police cars and an airport security vehicle waited on the tarmac, their presence professional rather than dramatic. David completed his landing checklist with the same careful attention he gave every flight, regardless of what had happened during the journey. The passengers stayed seated when the seatbelt sign went off, an unusual show of patience and respect. Even those with tight connections seemed to understand the importance of letting the situation resolve properly. The three bikers remained quiet, their earlier aggression replaced by what looked like genuine reflection. 2 FBI agents boarded first, their approach professional and low-key. "Nice work, Captain," the lead agent said quietly to David. "We saw the video. Someone uploaded it before you landed." He gestured to his phone, where the footage had already gathered thousands of views. The college student who'd recorded the incident raised his hand. "Sorry about that," he said, looking slightly embarrassed. "I just thought people should see how well it was handled." The agent nodded, understanding that in today's world, every incident becomes part of the public conversation. As the three men were escorted off the plane, Buck turned back. "Captain," he said, his voice carrying a mix of embarrassment and respect, "I've been riding with the club for 15 years. Never met anyone who handled us like that. Made me think maybe we've been going about things the wrong way." David's response was simple but sincere. It's never too late to choose a different path. The exchange was brief, but several passengers later commented on how it captured the entire spirit of what had happened. The rest of the deplanning process turned into something unexpected, almost like a community event. Passengers who had been strangers 3 hours ago now chatted like old friends, sharing their perspectives on what they'd witnessed. A young boy asked for David's autograph, making his mother smile apologetically, but David happily obliged. "You know what impressed me most?" the off-duty police officer commented as he gathered his belongings. "You control the situation without anybody losing face. In my line of work, that's a rare skill." His words carried the weight of professional appreciation. Lisa and her crew received their share of praise too. "The way you all stayed calm," a businessman commented, "made us feel safe even when things got tense." The other flight attendants smiled, professional to the end, but clearly appreciating the recognition. Outside the gate, a small crowd had gathered. News travels fast in the age of social media. A local reporter tried to get a statement, but David politely declined. "Just doing my job," he said, like any other pilot would. His humility wasn't an act. He genuinely believed that. Tom, his co-pilot, patted him on the back as they headed to file their report. "You know this is going to be a training video, right?" he joked. "How to handle difficult situations at 36,000 feet. They both laughed, the kind of laughter that comes after tension finally releases. Back home the next day, David sat in his favorite chair, finally reading the email from his daughter about medical school. The news coverage played quietly on TV. The incident had gone viral, with aviation experts praising the textbook handling of the situation. His phone kept buzzing with messages from old Air Force buddies who'd recognized his technique. But what stuck with him most was a note Lisa had handed him before they parted ways at the airport. It was from the elderly couple who'd been sitting near the front. "Thank you," it read, "for showing us that strength isn't about domination, it's about protection." The airline's review board met the following week. Their conclusion was unanimous. The incident would become part of their training program. Not because of the defensive techniques used, but because it demonstrated how professional conduct, calm authority, and respect for human dignity could transform a potentially dangerous situation into a moment of learning. Social media buzzed with various takes on the incident, but one comment seemed to capture it best. "Watch how this pilot handles 3 angry bikers. No shouting, no violence, just pure professional skill." The video became a case study in conflict resolution, shared by everyone from flight schools to business management courses. A month later, David received an unexpected letter. It was from Buck, written from a rehabilitation program he'd entered voluntarily. "That day on the plane," he wrote, "showed me there's a different way to handle things. Sometimes it takes sitting real strength to recognize what you've been doing wrong." As David prepared for his next flight, he tucked his daughter's medical school acceptance letter into his uniform pocket, a reminder of why every flight, every passenger, and every situation mattered. In the end, it wasn't about being a hero. It was about being professional, being prepared, and remembering that everyone, even those who make mistakes, deserves to be treated with dignity. The incident would be talked about for years in aviation circles, not for its drama, but for its lessons. That true authority comes from composure, not force. That professional training is about preventing escalation, not just responding to it. And that sometimes the most powerful way to handle a confrontation is to show people a better way forward.